Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me for episode 790 of the People Behind the Science podcast. Today, we're looking forward to revisiting our interview with our guest, Dr. Satesh Bidaisee. We know that many aspects of human health are linked with conditions in our environment, and Satesh's research aims to identify and understand environmental factors that can impact human health, both positively and negatively. He shares stories about his research, his career, and his life in our interview, and I hope you enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the People Behind the Science podcast. Today, I am delighted to introduce you to our guest scientist, Dr. Satesh Bidaisee. So, Satesh, welcome to our show today. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing well, and I hope that you and everyone listening is also doing well.
I'm doing well myself, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of your stories, your experiences, and your insights with our listeners today. But before we jump into those details, I want to take a moment to give them a little bit of background. So listeners, Satesh is a professor of public health and preventative medicine, as well as assistant dean for graduate studies at St. George's University in Grenada. He's also an adjunct professor in the Center for Global Health at Old Dominion University and a visiting professor at Chitkara University in India, as well as Kasetsart University in Thailand. Satesh received his Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree from the University of the West Indies St. Augustine Campus, a Master of Science degree in Public Health from St. George's University, and a Doctor of Education degree from the University of Sheffield. Now, prior to joining the faculty there at St. George's University, Satesh held a position at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as at the Ministry of Health in Trinidad and Tobago. Satesh is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Public Health, the Royal Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, the International Society on Infectious Diseases, and also the Society of Biology, as well as board certified by the United States National Board of Public Health Examiners. And in our interview today, Satesh is going to share some of his experiences both in life and in science. So Satesh, we're looking forward to getting to know you both as a scientist and also just in general as a person. So can you start by telling us how you like to spend your time when you're not doing science?
Besides work, my childhood passion and what I've been able to enjoy throughout my lifetime thus far is aviation. I have an interest in aircrafts. I love flying, privately, of course, and I enjoy particularly flying in the Caribbean region.
Excellent. So how did you get into aviation?
Well, my uncle was a pilot, and as a kid, there was some interest, I believe, where he would take me flying with a small Cessna 172 aircraft. And that experience just got me very comfortable in the air. But also, I was able to appreciate the fact that aviation is a privilege, which I'm thankful for, and one that I sort of had my eyes on while even engaging science. So somehow I never lost track of that aviation interest. So while I pursued science on my career, I continued to explore the interest. And when the time came, received my license and certification and continued to fly as a hobby.
Very cool. So how long have you had your pilot's license?
For almost a decade now.
Oh, wow. So you've got quite a few flights under your belt, right?
That's right.
Awesome. Well, great to hear a little bit more about some of your passions outside the world of science, but I would love to talk about your research next. So, Satesh, can you tell us how you describe what you do to someone who is maybe not familiar with your field?
Well, my positionality in public health and public health research is that human health is inextricably linked with the environment. And from that position, I tend to identify factors in the environment that influence human health, both in a positive way as well as a negative way.
Very interesting. And I know you do a wide variety of research projects within the work that you're doing, and I'm looking forward to chatting more about those as we go through our interview. But I would love to chat a little bit first about what motivates you. I think as a scientist, there's a lot on the to-do list most of the time. So I'm always looking for little bits of motivation and sayings and quotes that can help me throughout my day. Do you have a favorite one of yours?
What comes to my mind is a quote that I would have heard this quote from my grandparents' days and growing up in life. They would have reminded me of it over the period of time, and it stuck with me. And essentially, it suggests that what you can do tomorrow, do it today, and what you can do today, do it now. the idea is that time is precious and tomorrow is never promised. So what you can focus on in the present time, that's the only time that you have to really get your task done or achieve any particular dream or aspiration you may have.
Well, Satesh, I love that quote. And I must say, procrastination is something that I am very guilty of. Oftentimes, it's so tempting and so easy to just kind of keep putting things off till tomorrow. So what helps you prevent that procrastination?
I think it might have been my life experiences. As a teenager, I lost my mom in a vehicle accident, and that was a traumatic experience for me. I also appreciated the fragility of life. And then I also was severely injured during that time, and I had to recover as well. And also some years ago, I was diagnosed and have since recovered from testicular cancer as well.
Oh, wow.
And these experiences have encouraged me to really value time, really value life. So when I think about the tasks I have, when I think about the time I have, it reduces the likelihood of me procrastinating.
Definitely. Well, thank you for sharing some of these major life experiences that have kind of shaped the person you are today and how you approach life. And I think listeners, this is an important message. Seize the day. Don't keep putting things off till tomorrow, because you never know how many tomorrows you've got in the bucket. I'm curious, now that we've heard a little bit about what inspires you, to hear more about who inspires you. So Satesh, are there people who really rise up in your mind as inspirational figures or maybe mentors who had a big impact on you?
My mom was probably one of my biggest and my earliest mentor, especially in influencing my scientific inquiry and interest. And this was from my childhood days. As a 4 or 5 year old kid, I remember working with my mom. At that time, was in entomology. And the work she was focused on was controlling a mealybug or fungus for plants, which affected both food crops and botanicals. And her work included examining biological control for the mealybug. So they used a ladybird to control the mealybug, and eventually they also used a wasp to control the ladybird. And that entire experience fascinated me. It fascinated me in terms of the field work, examining sites where the mealybug was proliferating, and then releasing these biological agents in an effort to control them. And eventually the project was quite successful. So that experience really got me interested in the ability to use science to solve problems. It also inculcated in my mind my own ability to ask questions. So somehow I assumed a persona where people began referring to as questions. So this idea of asking questions emerged from that earliest experiences with my mom. And in the Caribbean islands, a lot of our activities include farming and agricultural communities. So my questions also was involving the practice of agriculture, whether it's food crops, whether it's animal production. So I would apply these questions to persons that I was encountering on a routine basis, which included farmers who were farming animals, for example. Why are animals having diseases? Why are some growing faster than others, for example? Why are they eating what they're eating? And all these questions allowed me to develop an affinity for the natural world. And this encouraged me to learn more. And the knowledge that I was learning along the way, I began to really identify that knowledge as a result of science. So that somehow developed my inquiry, developed my interests, and of course, my projected path in the area of science.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, Satesh, did you ever consider pursuing the science of entomology or maybe the science of aviation and flight?
Well, the aviation for me was always a passion. Mm-hmm. In the Caribbean, there is very limited scope for major careers in aviation beyond the local and regional airlines, and they are very limited in terms of their own capacity as well. So I never necessarily saw aviation as a sustainable pathway itself. But science certainly is well accepted, and we do have many institutions and organizations of higher education and science, whether it's governmental agencies or private industry as well. So science seemed at that time a more sustainable approach towards a career.
Gotcha. So can you tell us a little bit about how you went from this curious kid asking tons of questions, it sounds like, to where you are today? What are some of these key moments that took you to where you are now?
So in high school, we were exposed to the various diversity of subject areas, from mathematics to languages to science to history to geography to computer science to liberal arts. So we were exposed. But I believe some of the main recollections that I have from my high school days were experiences in the laboratory, for example, like dissecting a frog and observing the heart of the frog actually still contracting while we completely rendered the animal dead. And even the questions that involves and recognizing the heart itself, the heart muscle tissue, it has a life of its own even after death in terms of being myotonic, and understand that context. So that experience would have really fostered my interest in biology. And that eventually allowed me to think about biology as a discipline. And the way we package science subjects together in the Caribbean, that you have to take one as a group. So biology always was grouped with chemistry, physics, mathematics. Then I decided to put a group of subjects in area sciences. And then moved from high school. And at that time, as a middle-aged teenager, thinking about career choices, reflecting on my experiences with my mother. My mother had passed away at that time. And that, as a part of honoring her memory and her life, may have given me a value association with sort of pursuing a path in zoology. And that zoology interest then was expanded and explored further in the area of veterinary medicine, looking at all aspects of animal health, from anatomy to zoology and everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
And in veterinary medicine, as I began to study and practice veterinary medicine, I got involved in food safety issues. I got involved in understanding the linkage between humans and animals and the positive bonds that exist by companionship, for example. And that really got me interested in public health. Sometimes, for example, in veterinary medicine, we will synchronize estrus. And that the idea is for all of these animals to present on heat collectively so they can be fertilized as a group. They can be processed as a group for production purposes as well. We work with companion animals, and the idea is to promote the well-being of these animals, but at the same time, you're also advocating for human well-being, because humans are getting close to animals. Having companionship with animals promotes stress management. It increases healthy lifestyles because you're exercising with your animals as well. So that took me to public health. It took me to really exploring more how we can support the human-animal bond as well as mitigate the risk factors that animals may pose to humans, especially from food safety issues or infectious diseases. And then when I got into public health now, I realized that in human health in general, we know what the problems are and we know what the solutions are. But the gap is in effecting adequate behavior. And when I studied behavior now, I'm trying to see how I can influence and encourage behavior, I came across the social sciences. And the social scientists speak about knowledge, attitudes, perceptions, KAP, and how that translates into behavior. In that, people behave based on how they perceive something, based on their attitude towards that. And your perception and your attitude is a function of your knowledge, of your understanding. So I tried then to intervene in informing behaviors by influencing attitudes and perceptions through education. That then led me to consider learning about the science and the methodologies and the competences involved in education as well. So my education, my training took me from veterinary medicine to public health to education. And I see that as the tools that I needed to understand the risk factors that affect human health and then intervene, whether these interventions are clinically, whether they are environmentally, or whether they are behaviorally.
Absolutely. Well, it's been wonderful to hear almost the train of thought that led from one step to the next along your career path. And I think in hindsight, it's easy to make things sound like everything went smoothly and it was all very logical how you were making these different transitions. But was it difficult for you to decide to go back for this sort of second and third, in many cases, terminal degrees?
It's difficult to one extent because the difficulty lies in the effort and the time and the examination and the thesis and the defense.
Right.
So that was the difficult part. But in spite of the difficulty, the ambition and the interest in getting to a point that you feel will be valuable to you personally and professionally, that would have overridden any particular difficulty that I may have perceived.
Definitely. Well, I absolutely admire your determination to secure this additional training beyond that initial veterinary degree. And I think for me, it was hard enough to go through my dissertation once. I couldn't imagine doing 3 different ones. So I'm quite impressed. And we've talked about the different steps that took you to your career today, but I'd love to talk next about one of these projects you're working on. I know you're kind of working on everything from public health to infectious disease to food safety, and you mentioned a couple different areas. What is something that's ongoing right now in your lab that you are just the most excited about?
Just before I joined this conversation with you, I was speaking with some of my research colleagues about a study that we're actually conducting right now, and it's on dengue. Now, dengue virus, it's known, it's established. Dengue is endemic in the tropical regions and even including subtropical regions. And more than 50% of the world's population is at risk of exposure, at least. But we know a lot about dengue, but there's some aspects that we're not that familiar with. One of the aspects that we consider knowledge gap towards probably effecting treatment and understanding the pathology of this disease is exploring dengue exposure in people who do not come from dengue endemic regions. That means most of the studies done on dengue usually happen where dengue exists. And that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But we have an opportunity here at St. George's University where our students come from parts of the world, including non-endemic areas. So recently, as in the past 3 weeks, we have been working with students who are not exposed to dengue, and they are now in Grenada for the first time in an endemic region, and they are being exposed. So we are exploring the immune response to dengue of persons who are being exposed for the first time. And that response will sort of help us to understand the population characteristics of dengue. For example, in the endemic region of dengue, less than 20% of persons that develop clinical signs are actually presenting themselves clinically. That means that over 80% of persons that are exposed to dengue do not have clinical signs. That's one aspect. So we try to figure out what will be the immunoglobulin response and also what are the types, these different serotypes that are involved. And if different serotypes are providing different immune responses and reactions to the bodies. But we're starting off, first of all, with persons who have never been exposed before. And we hope that we will learn more about the immune response. We hope that we'll also figure out, for those that are exposed, what does that mean in terms of the different types of dengue? Will they be exposed to multiple types? Will they have different percentages of clinical symptoms based on these exposures over time? And see how that reflects into areas in the world in which the endemic status is known. Because everything we know about dengue is based on populations that are already exposed. And with people traveling around the world now, we will have people who are not exposed being exposed over time. So we will try to learn more about dengue in terms of the immunologically naive populations that exist.
Well, this is fascinating and sort of an angle of the question of infectious disease that I hadn't really considered, looking at these origins from endemic or non-endemic regions and that initial exposure. So I guess the question for me is, does it stop at dengue, or do you have other diseases lined up in the pipeline to come next?
Well, always when you think about vector-borne diseases, and the vector or that usually spreads dengue for us is the Aedes aegypti mosquito. And with that vector, they also spread other infectious diseases. So in the past, we would have had outbreaks of Zika virus or chikungunya virus spread by the same vector as well. And while these viruses are not currently circulating in the regional population, we have other diseases in the horizon I'm concerned about. We have Oropouche virus, we have Mayaro virus, which is in South America, and it's also spread by the Aedes aegypti mosquito. We also have cyclical episodes of yellow fever as well. So these are other sort of possibilities that may coincide with the vector and also with the dengue epidemic and endemic status that exists in the Caribbean regions and tropical regions in the world. So it's important for us to really appreciate and get an understanding of dengue, because while other infectious diseases have come and gone, dengue persists.
Well, thanks for sharing more about this current project. Very cool work going on in your lab. And we've talked about a lot of the great aspects of your career so far, Satesh, but I think we haven't yet touched on a lot of the struggles and the challenges, whether they're big failure moments or just these kind of day-to-day grind. So do you have a favorite failure or challenge or struggle that you faced in your career that you can share with us and maybe walk through how you got through it?
There's always failures. There's always struggles, of course. I have many examples, but there's one that always sort of evokes my memory and my emotions when I think about some of the struggles that I've had in the area of research. So in Grenada, we have a partnership with the nutmeg industry, and Grenada is very well known for nutmeg. It's considered a spice island as well, and that's primarily as a result of nutmeg production. Now, nutmegs is very much synonymous with Grenada, but we had some difficulty after Hurricane Ivan in 2004. And nutmeg production dropped. But currently, Grenada is the third largest producer of nutmeg in the world.
Oh, wow.
For a small island, that's quite substantial.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my role in the nutmeg industry is working with nutmeg workers themselves, especially the processing workers. These are workers who receive the raw nutmegs, and then they process these nutmegs to market. So it involves drying nutmegs, it involves different aspects of typing nutmegs, sorting nutmegs out as well, and preserving them for shipment. Now, when you take a product like raw nutmeg in a tropical environment and you dry that nutmeg, you also attract some mold growth in the nutmegs. And with this mold debris, that creates a lot of dust. So when we conducted health assessment of workers were complaining of postnasal drip, upper respiratory distress, sinusitis, which is consistent with some type of airborne exposure. And we made the link between the workers' respiratory distress and the presence in the environment and exposure potential of the dust from the mold growth on nutmegs. Coming out of that, we worked with engineers and we were able to identify a potential solution, which was solar dehydration. So we converted one of those shipping cargo containers into a solar dehydrator. We got a fund to really develop this project. We had a pilot study, first of all, and the pilot study demonstrated that our solar technology would reduce the time it takes to dry nutmegs by half the time, so production and processing will be faster. And secondly, when you confine the nutmegs in a solar dehydrator, you're essentially preventing mold growth by controlling humidity, etc. So we thought we found a solution where we were able to reduce the time it took to process nutmegs as well as mitigate the exposure to nutmeg workers to this mold and dust.
Right, win-win.
Yes, well, that was exciting for us. But here's where the challenge came in. When we began to install the pilot solar dehydrator on the side of the processing plant, and the nutmeg workers began to load the processing device itself, there was a lot of apprehensions and inertia on the part of the workers themselves. And the unions got involved as well because there was clear concern that the workers felt threatened and challenged that they would be replaced by these solar dehydrators themselves.
Gotcha.
And that led to a lack of use for the solar dehydrator, the initial solar dehydrator that we implemented. We worked with management, of course, and management was very excited about it. And we had all the data and evidence to show for it. And we were keen on preventing the stress, respiratory distress of the workers. But we had a lot of reservations on the part of the workers. And up to today, that intervention was and is not accepted on the part of the workers. So here we identify a problem, work towards a solution. But because of challenges in terms of workers' acceptance, which I appreciate and I accept, we were not able to fully translate our science into meaningful outcomes for these workers. So that remains a period and a point in time in my scientific life where I found solutions and it's difficult to apply the solution. So that is very disconcerting for me.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing this story. And I think it comes back to some of the elements of your training, kind of getting back to the behavior change and the education and just the implementation of some of these programs. Like you said, you found a solution and it's so tantalizingly close to being realized, but there's some resistance. And I think that is something where you really have to get in there in the community and understand what the resistance is and help work through some of those challenges. So what was that process like?
Well, what we tried to do was really focus on the health and safety of workers. So we did some workshop and training with these workers, get them to become more aware, change their attitude and perception, because the whole idea of knowledge is to change their attitude, perceptions, and inform behavior. So we worked towards developing a culture of health and safety and identifying strategies based on identified risk factors in the particular processing plant. The workers, we believe, appreciated it, but these workers themselves, that's their skill set. The community in which that processing plant belonged to, that community is synonymous with nutmeg processing. So there was a lot of cultural, traditional, social type of institutionalization then of the traditional nutmeg processing practices itself. And as much as we could within our own limitations, it would have taken changing the culture and society of a community.
Right.
And that, I think, would have been an overwhelming task on our part. So we accepted and we appreciated the difficulties in implementing the technology and the techniques that we proposed. So based on that, we continue to have a partnership with the workers themselves. We continue to monitor their health, of course. We try to identify ways, including personal protective equipment, try to modify the environment to an extent in terms of changing ventilation strategies, as well trying to manage more in a controlled manner the humidity effect as well of the nutmegs itself, and way to reduce as much as we can the mold growth and the workers' exposure. But they are still being exposed, of course. But having said that, though, we are trying to find other ways in which we can reduce the adverse health effects of the mold and dust in the environment.
Well, Satesh, this is a difficult and complex conundrum you've described here. So thanks for sharing it with our listeners today, just to kind of show some of the difficulties that scientists face. Like you said, you might come up with a solution, but implementation is not always easy and certainly cannot happen overnight in almost all cases. But we don't just want to talk about the difficulties, though. I'd love to hear about one of your success stories next.
So in the Caribbean region, our population is continuing to convert towards more chronic disease burdens. And while my research focused particularly in the first half of my career, my life in sciences, has been primarily infectious diseases, in fact, we cannot help but also engage in chronic disease management, because the number 1 through 5 causes of morbidity and mortality in the Caribbean region are chronic diseases.
Okay.
It's your cancers, it's your diabetes, it's your heart disease, it's your strokes, for example. And as a result of that, the population is affected with diabetes, for example. And diabetes is one part of it. We know how to prevent and control it, of course, but it's the complications of diabetes that is most concerning for me. What I mean by that is with diabetes, you develop peripheral neuropathy, you begin to lose sensation in your lower limbs and extremities, for example. And a lot of these communities are farming communities and farmers who are affected by them. So they have their feet, for example, in boots, or they're barefoot in the soil environment. They get cuts and wounds, and these wounds eventually develop infections and become gangrenous, and the only solution to save their life is amputations. Currently, in Grenada and several other Caribbean islands, we are on the list of the top countries that have the most number of amputations per capita associated with diabetic complications.
Oh, wow.
And that's a problem, because when we explore and examine these amputees, their life expectancy is 3 to 5 years post-amputation. They receive social isolation, they become unemployed, they lose their income, they develop further risk factors for other chronic diseases, including obesity. They have a very poor quality of life. The Caribbean community, from the work environment to the public infrastructure, is not well conducive to persons with disabilities. So access to even healthcare becomes more compromised. So there is a significant problem, especially among the amputee populations, secondary to diabetic complications. So from that perspective, we try to intervene. We conducted studies looking at the trends over time of diabetics, prevalence of complications of diabetes, as well as amputations. We partnered with Ipswich University in the United Kingdom, and Ipswich University have what they call an Ipswich touch-toe test, where they use a microfilament, and the microfilament is used to screen for persons with this peripheral neuropathy or loss of sensation, especially in their toes and their feet. Now, in Grenada or in the Caribbean islands, it's difficult to administer microfilaments to the community members to conduct tests on their own. So what we were able to adapt and adopt in our local setting was, instead of a microfilament, we do have a tool that we walk around every day. That's our fingers. So we developed a national campaign around World Diabetes Day, where we educated, we developed flyers, we developed YouTube video clips. We went to the television, radio, schools, community centers, and we assisted persons in conducting what we call a touch-toe test, which is taking your fingers, but someone else has to administer the test for you. The person has to extend their limbs on a chair or a heightened surface. Someone else needs to press gently on randomly selected toes, for example. And if there were any lack of sensation, the person would not indicate by raising their hand, for example. So during that time, we developed national campaigns, and we do that consistently around World Diabetes Day, which occurs in the month of November. And every time we do this, we first of all identify suspect cases, and that's around the community. Anyone can do it in the community. And if you think you're a suspect, come to the health center, let's confirm it. We consistently receive over 200 to 300 persons that have a suspect case.
Oh, wow.
Eventually, we're able to confirm about 50 of them or so that have peripheral neuropathy. Since that time, we have a cohort of persons now that we have a foot care program that we're working with. And that foot care program essentially is the same way we wash our hands and our face every day. Wash your feet. Look after your feet. Examine it. Clean it. If you have a cut or wound, have that attended to immediately by a healthcare professional. So we have a cohort of persons, and we work with them towards their foot health. We have a nice slogan, love the feet you walk on, for example. And the idea is to have these persons never require a limb amputation as a result of their complications and as a result of any peripheral neuropathy that they already have. So we want to work with them, continue to work with them to prevent injuries, to prevent infections, and of course to prevent amputations. Since at that time, we have not had any one of our 150 persons thus far that's in our cohort. Not a single one of them have had a need for an amputation. So we want to keep it that way. We wanted to live extended period of time, live a productive life, and not have a need for amputations and suffer the adverse consequences as a result. So we find a lot of benefit and a lot of success in a national community participatory project where persons in the communities at least identify suspect cases, which the healthcare providers then confirm. And if there are confirmed cases, we have a follow-up program for them towards their foot care. And it's a wonderful opportunity for us to reduce the burden of peripheral neuropathy secondary to diabetes. And of course, have these persons continue to live productive lives, which for everyone requires the use of your feet as well.
Certainly. Well, Satesh, congratulations on this success. I must say this idea of having the self-screening, the finger-toe touch test, I think is awesome. And it's something, like you said, that's way more accessible than some of the other clinical tests that are out there. And it sounds like this type of program, this type of campaign and intervention has the potential to have a big impact on people, not only just in the Caribbean. And you mentioned this collaboration with a group in Ipswich. Is this sort of something that you're looking at maybe expanding even further?
Yes. In fact, Ipswich University, they have piloted this approach even at their clinical site in the hospitals.
Oh, wow.
And they're finding a lot of benefits in even this finger-based touch-toe test as a basic screen. It's not confirmatory by any means, of course, but it's just a basic screen to identify suspect cases, which you can confirm later on.
Oh, that is amazing. Thanks so much for sharing it with me and our listeners today. And we've talked about a lot of aspects of your career, and I think we focused a little bit on the science and some of the work that you're doing in the lab, but we've talked a little bit about your passions outside of science as well. And for me, one of my passions is reading. So I love getting book recommendations from everyone that we feature on our program. So Satesh, can you add to our book list today with either a book that you've liked that's a science-related book or a non-science related book?
I think I may want to gravitate towards a non-science book.
Excellent.
Of course, we're consumed by scientific reading. But I think one of the most impactful reading experiences over time is really the non-scientific. It's almost like a relaxation, like a release sometimes to read non-scientific work. And I can probably think about multiple different publications, different books, different reading opportunities that really highlights for me. But there was one particular, it's more like an essay than a book, to be honest with you. And this essay was first given to me by my mentor, a mentor at Sheffield University, who gave me this essay to read even before I began working on my thesis. And essentially the essay was entitled On Bull.
I like it.
And it was written by Harry G. Frankfurt, professor from Princeton University. And that book essentially tries to provide some commentary on understanding that in life, in work out there, there's bulls all around us. And you have to, first of all, one, recognize that, identify it, and also work with it.
Right.
Because that is a reality. And no matter what we do in science, in life, we have to sometimes work with it, work in spite of it. And that essay really began my formalized engagement with this human experience and construct of birth, which the essay speaks about. I actually have been inspired so much by this that I even share it with my students now as a tradition.
That's awesome.
And we have discussions on it because it's good for us to understand from day one that we all recognize what this means. We all appreciate what that also suggests to our science, to our life, and also to develop strategies towards how we can work around it sometimes. So I actually would encourage persons to consider, and it's free. You can actually Google it and you can contact me. I have a PDF document, but Harry G. Frankfurt has a website and it's all there as well. So I would encourage your listeners to certainly access this resource and see if they can find value in that particular publication, which I found in my life, which impacts my science as well as my personal life.
Well, Satesh, I'm going to have to check this out. I must say, while our world is wonderful, it is far from perfect. And I think no matter where you go, you're going to encounter some BS. So this is something that is great for our listeners. And I love that it's freely accessible. So listeners, definitely check this out. We'll put it on our website as well so you can find it easily. And we've talked about some of the different aspects of your career as a scientist. And I think one of the things we've sort of hinted at are some of the opportunities that you get to travel in the work that you do in some of these adjunct appointments that you have. So Satesh, can you share with us your favorite travel memory, your favorite travel moment from your career as a scientist?
Fortunately, as a result of science, I've had many opportunities to travel indeed, and scientists do benefit from that as well. And we need that because a lot of our science is quite universal. Science is repeatable, it's falsifiable. These are the principles of science. And regardless of where in the world, science is almost like an accepted language. Regardless of different cultures, different languages, different geographies, scientists, when they get together, they can understand and they can relate and they can collaborate. So certainly traveling and interacting with people and partnering is critical in science. It is really not an individual effort anymore. Science is really a team-based approach. And the team that we need our world, we share problems together, and we need to share solutions and share strategies together. And that is only encouraged and supported through travel. Unfortunately, as well, for me, I've been able to travel across all the continents around the world. But one of my favorite places to visit and one of my favorite sites to collaborate with is Kasetsart University in Sakonnakhon in Thailand. They have a wonderful opportunity where they explore human health aspects with the environmental health and animal health as well, which really brings in the concept of One Health from a practical perspective. Now, Sakonnakhon is a northeast province in Thailand, and in that region, there's a very strong agricultural presence. And with agriculture, there's farming, there are communities, there's animals, and that allows for us to really see the challenges as well as opportunities to examine disease burdens. So we have been looking at parasitic diseases, for example, in animals as a result of food safety concerns. We have been looking at ways in which we can promote the whole of sustainable use of land towards water quality, towards land use and agricultural products for human benefit. So this idea of exploring human interactions with animals and the environment, I've been really impressed and fortunate to partner with colleagues at Kasetsart University for this particular purpose as well. One of the specifics that I'm familiar with there is also looking at the age-old disease of rabies. Now, rabies has been written historically, where humans have fatal consequences as a result of being exposed to the bite of a rabid dog, for example. And there's an opportunity to work, especially in highly densely populated areas in Southeast Asia, to manage the burden of rabies. Now, rabies is a highly preventable disease because you can vaccinate the animal reservoirs for rabies, especially the domestic dog, and through vaccination, stray dog control programs, we can certainly place a lot of effort and derive a lot of benefits towards human health. The cost for one vial of rabies vaccine is about 1,000, the cost it will take to treat a case. And that case may not even be treatable depending on the stage in which it's presented as well.
That's remarkable.
Yeah, so I actually find a lot of practical applications and foreseeable benefits as a result of the One Health related work that we participate in with our partners in Sakonnakhon in Thailand.
Phenomenal. So what was it about Thailand that initially drew your interest to start this collaboration?
Well, St. George's University is an international university, and we have faculty and students from 140 countries and counting.
Oh, wow.
One of the partners with us is Mahidol University in Thailand, and we have students, we have faculty, we have students visit Thailand for research opportunities. Throughout the time that I've been working with St. George's University, we have been able to meet colleagues and develop partnerships. I've been to conferences. And as a result of these discussions and collaborations, the event has led to specific projects based on particular needs and interests as well.
Well, Satesh, awesome project. And it's great to hear that you're able to really have this global presence working with people all around the world on some of the research projects that you do. And I love that you touched on just how phenomenal some of these people are and some of these collaborations that you've formed, because I think the idea of science as a team sport is not something that everyone thinks about. And just this idea of being able to meet wonderful people from all over the world and maybe break some of the stereotypes that people have about what scientists are like and what life as a scientist is like is phenomenal. And you've already shared this tradition of giving this wonderfully recommended essay to some of the students in your laboratory. But are there other traditions or memories or just fun or funny experiences that you've shared with some of these people you've worked with that really highlight this human side of science?
Funny enough, what I'm going to share with you and your listeners, to me, it's embarrassing, actually, but some people do find some humor in it. And essentially, it was in my time in Trinidad, where I'm from, working on an animal disease control. And one of the tasks that I had as a particular case was to attend a farming community and work with a farmer to explore what is considered a subclinical urinary tract infection in cows. It means that they're not necessarily displaying clinical signs, but you're seeing some evidence. For example, we will see some straining to urinate, frequent urinations, for example. And the idea is to help us with diagnosing, we need a urine sample, especially a midstream urine sample, which means that the animal has to be urinating. And during the course of the stream of the urination, you collect a sample. Now, when I went at the time, the farmer had the cow with free ranging, so I could not collect the sample at the time. So I gave the farmer the urine collection cup, And I indicated to the farmer that, please, when you get a chance, I will pass that. Refrigerated when you do collect a sample, of course.
Sure.
But please collect a midstream sample of the urine for me. And that way I can then determine what are some of the debris or the findings to determine if, in fact, it is a urinary tract infection. So that same day, maybe in the afternoon period, maybe 2-3 hours after, I returned to the farmer, and the farmer was unable to collect the urine sample for me.
Oh, no.
So on inquiry, I asked the farmer why. And the farmer responded to me that he did not have time to take the cow to the river.
Oh, my goodness. A midstream sample.
I actually felt very stupid, to be honest with you. Because here I was with an assumption that the farmer knew, but honestly, it was my fault because there was a gap in communication. I should have effectively articulated the request to the farmer. And I failed to do so. That experience was actually a significant lesson for me. Mm-hmm. And I've never forgotten it. It's a significant memory. When I share to people, it's funny for them. Right. And for me, it's a constant humbling experience, as it allows me to remind myself that my communication must be very effective. And no matter in what situation or who am I speaking with, if my information is not transferred effectively, well, then that was not effective communication at all. So the idea is, for me personally, to keep reminding myself of that, to hopefully not repeat that mistake again.
Well, I love this story, Satesh. I must say, it's something where I think scientists are always trying to be mindful of using jargon when they're communicating with the public. And it's something that some of these things that you just take for granted that you don't even think about as being jargon, that you have to constantly be mindful and watchful of that.
Yes, exactly.
Well, were you able to eventually get the sample, I must ask?
Well, the farmer was able to, not me, after I corrected my error in communicating.
So the story has a happy ending too, which is even better. Well, Satesh, wonderful story to share with our listeners. And we've talked about some of the different challenges and some of the things that you faced in terms of getting the research done in the field that you're in. And I think for every scientist, there's always something standing in the way between them and being able to address that dream question or to get the project done, whether that's funding or staff or technology or feasibility or even time. So is there a particular question, Satesh, that you've been just dying to answer, but haven't been able to tackle yet?
I'm reminded of my own mortality from my own cancer experiences. Mm-hmm. And I continue to work with people who are fighting, who are surviving cancer. And that does occupy a lot of my community service work. It does occupy a lot of my interests and my desire to keep working with persons in that regard. And I believe the question that always remains in my mind is there a particular marker? Is there a particular type of biochemical derivative that we can identify that is consistent with cancers and allow that to inform the technology and the treatment which we can use to trigger off apoptosis or programmed cell death among these neoplastic or cancer cells? I'm very passionate about that. And I know that there's a lot of research going on in that regard. And we are looking at ways to diagnose cancer earlier. We are looking at ways in which we can effect the staging of cancer treatment. We are looking at different strategies towards therapeutic management and treatment as well. And that's continuous ongoing. But I share those questions. My particular question is, can we identify a commonality that exists among these changing cells and target that commonality using a strategy? We talk about programmed cell death and chemotherapy, radiation therapy. All of these, what they do essentially is target rapidly growing cells. And if there's a way in which we can find a solution for that, I will particularly be very happy about that. And I know that cancer is already the number one cause for many countries, and eventually for the world, it will be the number one cause of death and morbidity. And it's not just an individual effect, but it affects families, it affects communities, it affects countries as well. So I believe that the question that will help individuals, families, communities, and populations at large is there a strategy to effectively kill a cancer cell without even compromising the health of the patient as well? Because sometimes we bring patients close to death in order to kill the cancer.
Right. I think sometimes the side effects of the treatments are so severe that patients sometimes decide not to undergo the treatment at all, which is devastating.
Exactly. So I'm really interested in finding a strategy to target specifically those cells and leave the healthy cells alone and just focus on that programmatic cell death for those changing cancer cells itself. I have a personal interest in that question.
Well, Satesh, this is a big question, and I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds these days, because you brought up a good point that as time goes on, as our life expectancy continues to increase, cancer is becoming a bigger and bigger problem that a lot of people are facing in their own lives. So finding this silver bullet solution, I think, would be just phenomenal. So great question for me and our listeners to ponder today. And you've shared so much in terms of some of your insights, your stories, and your advice. I'd love for you to give our listeners one last piece of advice, perhaps the best piece that you've ever received in your own life.
The best piece of advice that I've received in my own life was probably from my own interpretation of how I incorporated aviation into my philosophy. And I share this with my students all the time. When you think about flying an aircraft, for example, if you want to increase your altitude, you have to increase your power and you have to bring your nose up. You have to lift the nose then, essentially, and you will climb. If you want to descend, you reduce your power and you drop your nose and you will descend. So somehow your nose position in an aircraft determines your altitude. It determines whether you are maintaining level flight, if you are climbing, or if you are essentially losing altitude. Now, the orientation of the nose for aviation is called attitude, the aircraft's attitude, whether it's a nose up attitude or a nose down attitude. And what that principle of flight, what it suggests to me is depending on your nose position or your attitude, it determines your altitude.
Okay.
And many times when we think about our destination in life, or the altitude or the heights we reach in life, personally or in science or otherwise, many people think it's all based on your knowledge, it's all based on your aptitude, it's all based on your competencies, etc. And that's important, yes. But fundamentally for me, is also your attitude. So if I were to extrapolate from my aviation interest and experience and apply that to inspiration for your listeners, I would suggest that it is your attitude and not just your aptitude which determines your altitude.
I love it, Satesh. Wonderful message to give our listeners. And I learned something new today. I didn't realize that the attitude was the term for that. So very cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So is there any other last message you want to leave our listeners with today?
As it relates to science, science is not just a career. It's not just a discipline. Science is a human endeavor. It's part of our innate interest. Over time, over history, we have looked at the sun, the moon, and the stars to explain realities for our lives. Our earliest understanding, from my reference point, is astrology. We try to explain phenomena on the earth by looking at the influence of the planets, for example. People still read their horoscopes today as a result of that. And then over time, as we learn more, Hippocrates, for example, brought the concept of health and disease down to earth. Mm-hmm. He said your health is based on the airs, the waters, and the places. Then over time as well, we learned about malaria. Malaria means bad air. Right. Because we thought that disease was as a result of bad air or bad smells. And then we developed technology like microscope, for example, to look at microorganisms. And over time, we have been able, as part of human development, as part of social evolution, that has informed our knowledge, our understanding. Mm-hmm. I consider that to be science. So my last note is that we are in a constant quest for knowledge, for understanding, for development. And it's science that will enable us to do that, whether it's laboratory science, bench science, whether it's medical sciences, whether it's social sciences. They all play a role. So I believe that each and every one of us have a part to play because we collectively will determine the future because our reality will eventually be expressed physically as well. Hollywood is great at predicting the future.
Right.
Many times you see these movies and these books that you say, well, hold on, that could be the future for us. And the future is in our minds. What we perceive, that will be our reality. And it's science that will support this human endeavor going forward. Whether it's curing diseases, whether it's taking flight beyond the planet, for example, it's all science that will help us. So I would encourage people to embrace it, to participate in it, because invariably, from my perspective, science is quintessentially human.
Well, Satesh, wonderful note to end on. I love that you highlighted this human side of science because that's something that we strive to show on our program. And I couldn't agree with you more here. So great message for our listeners. And if our listeners want to learn more about you and all the wonderful work you're doing, where should they go or how should they get in touch?
Well, feel free to go onto my university's website, St. George's University. That is www.sgu.edu. In there, you can find me, Satesh Bidaisee. It's on a research profile, for example, and you'll find my background. You'll find some of the projects I'm involved in, as well as ways in which you can contact me through email through telephone, for example, as well. But if I may just say my email address and contact as well, my Skype contact is satesh.bidaisee, which is my name with a dot in between the first and the surname, satesh.bidaisee. And also, if you want to email me, you can email me sbidaisee, SBIDAISEE @sgu.edu. And I will be happy to engage and interact with your listeners. I am where I am today because I have been fortunate to benefit from mentors in my life. I've been able to stand on the shoulders of many giants. And I believe in the cycle of life that I also need to do the same for other people as well. So I am willing and I'm happy in any way that I can serve to inspire, to mentor, and to partner people in any way in which they feel that I can contribute to as well.
Wonderful. Well, Satesh, thank you so much for talking to all of us here today and for sharing some of your stories. And listeners, definitely get in touch if you have any questions. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you as well. And I look forward to the opportunity for your series to continue to inspire persons and also to reinvigorate persons who are already in science.
Well, I sincerely appreciate that. And listeners, it's been great to have you with us here today. We hope that you're leaving this interview inspired as well. And we'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.